The moment he smiled in that courtroom, he truly believed the case was already over, but he had no idea what had not been said yet. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I still remember standing outside courtroom 4B in downtown Chicago that morning, holding a thin folder of documents that no one else in my family knew existed. Inside that courtroom, my father, Everyth Mitchell, was already inside speaking with his attorney, Blake Harris, as if the outcome had been decided long before the judge even entered the room. The air in the hallway felt unusually cold for an indoor government building, the kind of sterile silence that always seems to exist in legal corridors where people wait for decisions that will permanently change their lives. I remember watching other families sit quietly on wooden benches, some reviewing papers, others staring at the floor, and I realized how similar they all looked in their shared tension, even though every case was completely different. My father had arrived earlier that morning with absolute confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his posture calm in a way that suggested certainty rather than hope. He had not asked me to come with him. In fact, until I arrived on my own, he did not even acknowledge that I would be present. That alone already told me something about how he believed this day would unfold. The case itself was simple on the surface according to public records, a financial dispute involving family assets and responsibility claims, but the truth behind it was far more complicated than anything that had been presented in preliminary hearings. He had spent weeks reviewing documents that were never included in official submissions, conversations that were never recorded in transcripts, and one final piece of information that no one in that courtroom expected to see. As I stood in the hallway, I could hear faint voices coming from inside the courtroom, my father speaking with controlled confidence, his lawyer responding in measured legal language that sounded like victory already being prepared in advance. There was a rhythm to their tone that suggested certainty, as if the outcome was not something to be decided, but something to be confirmed. I remember tightening my grip on the folder in my hands, not out of fear, but out of awareness that whatever happened next would not be something that could be reversed once revealed. The hallway monitor announced that Case 17 was about to resume, and I felt a shift in the atmosphere around me, as people began to stand, adjust their clothing, and move toward the courtroom doors. I followed them slowly, aware that every step I took carried information that had not yet been introduced into the formal proceedings. When I finally reached the courtroom entrance, I saw my father seated confidently at the plaintiff's table, leaning slightly toward his attorney, speaking in low tones that carried no trace of uncertainty. From where I stood, it looked like a moment already concluded in his mind. But what he did not see, what no one in that room had accounted for yet, was that I was not there as a passive observer. He was there with something that had not been included in any argument, any filing, or any statement presented so far. And as the clerk called the court to order, I realized that the most important moment of the entire case had not begun in that room yet, because what was about to be introduced had not been seen by anyone except me. As I stepped into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted immediately from quiet anticipation to structured authority, the kind of silence that feels heavier once you are inside it rather than outside it. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember standing just inside the doorway for a brief moment before taking my seat, observing how every movement in the room seemed controlled, measured, and already aligned with expectations that had been formed long before the judge entered. My father, Everyth Mitchell, was seated confidently at the plaintiff's table, leaning slightly toward his attorney, Blake Harris, as if they were not preparing for an uncertain legal process but instead confirming a conclusion they believed had already been secured. There was a visible calmness in his posture, the kind that does not come from neutrality but from certainty, and that certainty shaped the way he interacted. With every small detail in the room. Across from him, I could see the opposing counsel arranging documents in a careful sequence, while the judge's bench remained empty for the moment, adding a brief pause of stillness before proceedings would begin. I remember sitting down slowly, placing the folder I carried on my lap without opening it yet, because I knew that what I had brought into this courtroom was not meant to be introduced casually or prematurely. Around me, the court clerk prepared final documentation, and the faint rustle of papers created a rhythm that contrasted with the controlled silence of everyone waiting. My father did not look in my direction at first, which was not unusual, But what stood out was the complete absence of acknowledgement, as if my presence had no relevance to the structure of what he believed was about to happen. His focus remained entirely on his attorney, and I could hear fragments of their conversation even from where I was seated. Phrases like final confirmation and strong position being exchanged in a tone that suggested the outcome was already being mentally recorded as a victory. It was in that moment that I became even more aware of the weight of what I was holding, not physically, but in terms of timing and consequence. The courtroom doors closed fully, and the bailiff called for order, signaling that the case was officially resuming. The judge entered shortly after, and everyone stood in unison before sitting again, restoring the formal structure of authority that defines every legal proceeding in this building. As arguments began, I listened carefully, not because I was uncertain about what was being said, but because I was tracking how incomplete the narrative was becoming as each side presented their structured version of events. My father's attorney spoke first, laying out financial claims with confidence, referencing documents that had already been submitted in prior hearings, reinforcing a position that appeared strong on the surface. My father occasionally nodded slightly, reinforcing agreement, his expression calm and composed, almost detached from any sense of doubt. Yet as I watched and listened, I became increasingly aware of the gap between what was being presented and what had never been introduced. There were pauses in testimony where silence filled the room, and in those pauses I could feel the presence of something unspoken, something that had not yet been acknowledged by either side. I remember tightening my grip slightly on the folder in my hands, because I understood that the moment I chose to open it would not simply add information to the case. It would change the structure of how everything in this courtroom was being interpreted. And as the judge leaned forward slightly, signaling attention to the next stage of proceedings, I realized that the confidence my father carried into this room was still intact, unaware that the foundation supporting it had not yet been fully tested. As the courtroom proceedings continued, I found myself increasingly aware that what was unfolding was not simply a presentation of legal arguments, but a carefully structured narrative where each side attempted to control interpretation rather than just present facts. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting still in my seat as the opposing counsel began their response, introducing counterpoints that challenged the claims made by my father's attorney, Blake Harris, but still within the boundaries of what had already been formally documented. My father, David Mitchell, remained composed at the plaintiff's table, his posture unchanged, his expression calm in a way that suggested he believed nothing presented so far had meaningfully threatened his position. That confidence was still intact, and it shaped the way he leaned slightly toward his attorney, occasionally exchanging brief comments that carried the tone of reassurance rather than concern. As the legal exchange continued, I noticed how the judge remained observant but neutral, carefully tracking each submission without revealing any immediate interpretation, maintaining the procedural distance that defines courtroom authority. I remember the sound of pages turning, the controlled pacing of legal language, and the way each argument built upon previous statements without yet introducing anything outside the established framework of evidence. It was within this structured progression that I became even more aware of the absence that had been present since the beginning of the session, the absence of a specific element that had not yet been introduced into the record. My grip on the folder in my hands remained steady, but I did not move to open it yet, because I understood that timing within a courtroom is not just procedural, it is strategic, and once a piece of information is introduced, it immediately becomes part of how everything else is interpreted. My father's confidence remained visible, and I could see it in the way he occasionally glanced toward his attorney with subtle acknowledgement, as if confirming that everything was proceeding according to expectation. Yet beneath that visible confidence, there was an underlying structure to the case that had not yet been challenged, a structure built on what had been included, but equally on what had been excluded. As the opposing counsel concluded their current argument, there was a brief pause in the courtroom, a silence that felt heavier than the spoken words that had preceded it. During that pause, I noticed the judge adjusting focus toward the next phase of proceedings, signaling that the case was moving forward in sequence, but still within the same limited evidentiary boundaries. It was in that moment that I became fully aware that the difference between perception and reality in this courtroom was not going to be resolved through repetition of existing arguments, but through the introduction of something that had not yet been acknowledged on record. My father remained unaware of that distinction, continuing to operate within a framework that still appeared stable from his perspective, while I sat with the awareness that the structure he believed was complete was actually missing a critical component. The room itself remained orderly, professional, and controlled, yet within that order I could feel a shift building quietly, not through action, but through anticipation. And as the judge prepared to transition to the next submission, I realized that the moment approaching was not just another procedural step, but the point at which everything that had been assumed so far would soon be tested against something that had not yet entered the conversation. As the courtroom moved deeper into its procedural sequence, I became increasingly aware that the structure of the case was approaching a point where everything presented so far would soon be tested against something that had not yet been introduced into the official record. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting still as the judge reviewed the next stage of proceedings, while both legal teams prepared to continue within the established framework of arguments and counterarguments that had already defined the tone of the session. My father, David Mitchell, remained in the same composed position at the plaintiff's table, his confidence still visible in the way he maintained calm posture and brief exchanges with his attorney, Blake Harris, as if nothing had yet challenged the direction of the case. That confidence, however, was based entirely on what had already been seen and accepted in earlier stages, and it did not account for what had not yet been presented. As the opposing counsel resumed speaking, they continued working within the boundaries of existing evidence, reinforcing interpretations that were already part of the case record, while carefully avoiding any reference to material that had not been formally submitted. The judge remained attentive, occasionally making brief notes, maintaining neutrality while ensuring procedural order. I remember the sound of the courtroom being almost rhythmic at that point, with legal statements followed by pauses, each side taking turns reinforcing their respective positions without yet breaking the established structure of understanding. Yet beneath that surface-level progression, I was fully aware that the most important element of this entire case was still absent from the discussion. It was not something that had been forgotten accidentally in the usual sense of legal oversight, but something that had been deliberately excluded from the initial narrative presented by my father's side. He could feel the weight of that absence more clearly with each passing moment. Because the longer the case continued without it, the more complete the opposing narrative appeared to those who did not know otherwise. My grip on the folder remained steady, and I found myself carefully observing timing rather than emotion, because I understood that introducing information in a courtroom is not only about what is said, but when it is said. My father did not appear to sense any change in the structure of the proceedings, and his confidence remained intact, shaped by the assumption that all relevant information had already been accounted for in the case. That assumption was visible in the way he occasionally leaned toward his attorney, speaking in short, controlled phrases that suggested reassurance rather than uncertainty. However, from my position, I could see that the framework supporting his confidence was built entirely on an incomplete version of events, one that had not yet been challenged by what I was holding. As the judge signaled for the next phase of arguments, I noticed a subtle shift in attention within the courtroom, a collective readiness for continuation that assumed stability in the narrative presented so far. It was in that moment that I recognized how fragile that stability actually was, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not yet been introduced. The courtroom remained orderly, formal, and controlled, but within that structure there was now a clear point of tension forming around the missing element that only I was prepared to present. And as the proceedings prepared to move forward, I understood that the next transition would not simply continue the case, but would determine whether the existing understanding would remain intact or be fundamentally redefined by what had been withheld until this exact moment. As the courtroom entered the next phase of proceedings, I could feel a subtle but significant shift in the atmosphere, not because anything had yet changed on the surface, but because the structure of what was being accepted as complete information was about to be tested against something that had not yet been introduced. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting still as the judge signaled for continuation, while both legal teams prepared to proceed within the same procedural boundaries that had defined every exchange so far. My father, David Mitchell, remained composed at the plaintiff's table, his posture unchanged, his confidence still visible in the way he maintained steady attention toward his attorney, Blake Harris, as if the direction of the case remained fully under control. That confidence was built entirely on the assumption that the record before the court was complete, and that assumption had remained unchallenged up to this point in the proceedings. As the opposing counsel resumed speaking, they continued presenting arguments that aligned with previously submitted evidence, reinforcing a narrative that appeared stable because it had not yet been confronted by anything outside its established structure. The judge listened carefully, maintaining neutrality, occasionally glancing down at documents, ensuring that each side remained within procedural limits. He remembered noticing how the courtroom itself seemed to operate on a rhythm of controlled exchange, where each statement followed a predictable pattern of assertion and response, creating the appearance of completeness even when something essential was missing. My attention, however, was not focused on what was being repeated, but on what had not yet been acknowledged. The folder in my hands remained closed, but its presence felt increasingly significant as the session continued, because I understood that what I was holding represented information that existed outside the current legal narrative. My father's demeanor did not change, and there was no indication that he was aware of any impending disruption to the case structure he believed was already secure. He occasionally leaned slightly toward his attorney, speaking in low tones that suggested continued confidence in the direction of the proceedings. Yet from where I was seated, I could see that this confidence was not based on the totality of facts, but on a version of events that had been carefully constructed within the limits of what had been previously submitted. As the opposing counsel concluded their current line of argument, there was a brief pause in the courtroom, a silence that marked the transition between segments of the case, and in that silence I became fully aware that this was the moment where structure and truth would soon either align or diverge completely. The judge prepared to move forward, signaling readiness for the next submission, and the entire courtroom collectively shifted its attention toward continuation, unaware that the most critical element of the case had not yet been introduced. I remember feeling a quiet clarity at that moment, not emotional intensity, but a focused awareness that timing had reached its point of inevitability. Everything so far had been preparation, but what was about to happen would determine whether the narrative presented in this courtroom would remain intact or be fundamentally altered by the introduction of what had been excluded from every previous statement. And as the judge looked up to proceed, I understood that the next action taken in this room would no longer be about reinforcing what was already known, but about revealing what had been deliberately left out of the record until this exact point in time. As the courtroom moved into the next stage of proceedings, I became fully aware that the atmosphere had reached a point of structural tension where everything that had been presented so far was now waiting for validation against something still absent from the official record. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting motionless as the judge prepared to continue, while both legal teams adjusted their positions in anticipation of the next submission within the established legal sequence. My father, David Mitchell, remained at the plaintiff's table with the same composed confidence he had carried throughout the entire hearing, his attention still aligned with his attorney, Blake Harris, as if the case remained fully under control and unaffected by any unknown factors. That confidence was unchanged, but it was based entirely on the assumption that all relevant information had already been included in the courtroom narrative, an assumption that had gone unchallenged until this moment. As the opposing counsel concluded their previous argument, a brief silence followed, and in that silence I became increasingly aware of the significance of timing, because the structure of legal proceedings often creates the illusion of completeness even when critical elements have not yet been introduced. The judge reviewed the case file again, maintaining procedural neutrality, signaling readiness for continuation while ensuring that both sides remained within formal boundaries. He remembered noticing how the courtroom maintained its controlled rhythm, with no disruption in behavior, no visible tension beyond what was expected in a legal environment, yet internally I understood that the most important shift in the case had not yet occurred. The folder in my hands remained closed, but its presence felt increasingly decisive, not because of emotion, but because of its position outside the established evidentiary sequence. My father's expression remained steady, and there was no visible indication that he anticipated any change in the direction of the case. He occasionally exchanged brief, quiet comments with his attorney, reinforcing a sense of stability that was entirely dependent on the assumption that the record before the court was complete. From my position, however, I could clearly see that the structure supporting that assumption had never accounted for what I was holding. As the judge signaled for the next phase of proceedings, I became aware that attention in the courtroom had collectively shifted toward continuation, with every participant expecting further reinforcement of existing arguments rather than disruption of them. That expectation itself created a kind of procedural confidence that masked the possibility of change, because nothing in the visible structure suggested that the narrative was incomplete. Yet I knew that the absence of one critical element meant that the entire interpretation of the case was still unstable, even if no one else in the room had recognized it yet. I remember focusing on the precise moment of transition, understanding that courtroom timing determines not only what is said, but how it is perceived once introduced. The judge leaned slightly forward, preparing to proceed, and in that instant I became fully aware that the next action would no longer be a continuation of what had already been established, but the point at which everything previously accepted as complete would be measured against what had not yet been revealed. And as the courtroom prepared to move forward, I understood that the stability my father believed he had secured was about to be tested by something that had remained outside the record until this exact moment of procedural inevitability. As the courtroom reached the next procedural transition, I became fully aware that the atmosphere had shifted into a moment where everything previously presented was now being held in suspension, waiting for a final structural test against something that had not yet been introduced into the official record. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting still as the judge prepared to move forward with the next phase of the case, while both legal teams adjusted their attention toward what was expected to be a continuation of already established arguments. My father, David Mitchell, remained composed at the plaintiff's table, his posture unchanged, his confidence still visible in the way he maintained calm engagement with his attorney, Blake Harris, as if the direction of the case remained fully predictable and stable. That confidence was still intact, and it was reinforced by everything that had been presented so far, which had consistently supported his interpretation of the situation without introducing any visible contradictions. As the courtroom proceeded, the opposing counsel concluded their current position, and a brief silence followed, creating a moment where the procedural rhythm of the trial temporarily paused before continuing. In that silence, I became increasingly aware that what defined this moment was not what had been said, but what had not yet been allowed into the record. The judge reviewed the case file again with measured attention, maintaining neutrality and ensuring that the proceedings remained within proper legal structure, signaling readiness for continuation while still unaware of what was about to be introduced. I remember noticing how the courtroom maintained its formal balance, with no visible disruption in behavior, no indication of procedural irregularity, and yet internally I understood that this balance was based on incomplete information. The folder in my hands remained closed, but its presence now felt like the only variable in the room that had not yet been accounted for within the legal narrative. My father's expression remained steady, and there was no visible sign that he anticipated any change in the structure of the case. He occasionally leaned toward his attorney, exchanging brief comments that reflected continued confidence in the outcome, reinforcing a belief that everything necessary for judgment had already been presented. From my position, however, I could clearly see that this belief was dependent on a version of the case that excluded the information I was holding. As the judge signaled for the next submission, attention in the courtroom shifted collectively toward continuation, with every participant expecting further reinforcement of existing arguments rather than disruption. That expectation created a controlled sense of procedural certainty, where the absence of visible conflict was interpreted as stability. Yet I knew that stability was only apparent, because it did not account for the missing element that had not yet been introduced into the official proceedings. I remember focusing on the precise moment where continuation becomes transformation in a courtroom, because legal timing determines not only what is accepted, but how it reshapes everything that came before it. The judge leaned slightly forward, preparing to proceed, and in that instant I understood that the next action would no longer function as a continuation of established arguments, but as the point where the entire case would either remain intact or begin to reorganize around a truth that had not yet been acknowledged. And as the courtroom prepared for the next phase, I became fully aware that what my father believed to be a secured victory was still dependent on information he had never accounted for, and that this dependency was about to be exposed within the structure of the very system he trusted most. As the courtroom reached what felt like its most decisive procedural threshold, I became fully aware that the entire structure of the case was now poised at the exact point where the introduction of a single missing element could permanently alter everything that had been presented up to this moment. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting motionless as the judge prepared to transition into the next stage of proceedings, while both legal teams adjusted their focus with the expectation that the case would continue along its established trajectory. My father, Everyth Mitchell, remained at the plaintiff's table with the same composed confidence he had maintained throughout the entire hearing, his posture steady, his expression controlled, and his attention still aligned with his attorney, Blake Harris, as if nothing in the courtroom posed any real threat to the position he believed had already been secured. That confidence had not wavered at any point during the proceedings, because everything he had seen so far had reinforced the narrative he believed was complete. As the courtroom settled into a brief silence before the next submission, I became increasingly aware that silence itself carried more significance than any argument that had been made, because it represented the exact space where incomplete information still existed without being challenged. The judge reviewed the case file once more, maintaining strict neutrality, signaling readiness to proceed while remaining unaware that the structure of the case was still missing a critical component that had not yet entered the record. I remember noticing how every participant in the room appeared aligned with the assumption that the case was already fully defined, with no visible expectation that anything outside the established evidence could still appear. That assumption created a controlled atmosphere of procedural certainty, even though I understood that certainty was only valid within the limits of what had already been introduced. The folder in my hands remained closed, but at this point its significance was no longer symbolic. It had become the only element in the courtroom that existed outside the accepted narrative structure. My father's expression remained unchanged, and his confidence continued to reflect a complete reliance on the record as it stood. He occasionally exchanged brief, calm remarks with his attorney, reinforcing the belief that the direction of the case remained stable and fully under control. However, from my position, I could clearly see that this stability was conditional, dependent entirely on the absence of what I was holding. As the judge signaled for the next phase, attention in the courtroom shifted collectively toward continuation, with no indication that anyone anticipated disruption. Yet I understood that disruption was not required for transformation to occur in a courtroom. All that was needed was the introduction of information that had not yet been considered. I remember focusing on the exact moment where procedural flow transitions into irreversible change, because legal systems do not shift gradually in perception. They shift at the instant when incomplete understanding is replaced by full disclosure. The judge leaned slightly forward, preparing to proceed, and in that moment I became fully aware that the next action would not simply extend the case, but would determine whether everything that had been presented so far would remain intact or be fundamentally restructured by what had been excluded until now. And as the courtroom prepared for continuation, I understood with complete clarity that my father's confidence was still anchored in a version of reality that had not yet been tested against the missing truth, and that this test was about to begin at the very next procedural step. As the courtroom reached its final and most decisive procedural moment, I became fully aware that everything leading up to this point had been building toward a single transition where the missing element would either be introduced or remain permanently excluded from the official record. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting still as the judge prepared to move forward with what appeared to be the next standard phase of the proceedings, while both legal teams remained composed and focused on the established structure of the case. My father, Everyth Mitchell, still carried the same calm confidence he had shown from the beginning of the hearing, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, and his belief in the completeness of the case fully intact. Nothing in his behavior suggested anticipation of disruption, because from his perspective, every necessary component of the case had already been presented and validated through earlier arguments. As the courtroom settled into a brief silence before the next submission, I became increasingly aware that this silence was not emptiness, but the final space before transformation, where what was missing still existed outside the boundaries of official recognition. The judge reviewed the case file one last time, maintaining procedural neutrality, signaling readiness to proceed, while remaining unaware that the structure of the case was still incomplete. I remember noticing how every person in the room appeared aligned with expectation rather than uncertainty, as if the case was simply moving toward conclusion rather than approaching a point of structural change. That perception of stability was shared by everyone except me, because I was holding the only element that had not yet been introduced into the record. The folder in my hands felt heavier not physically, but in significance, because it represented information that existed outside the current legal narrative and had not yet been tested against the assumptions already formed in this courtroom. My father leaned slightly toward his attorney, exchanging brief remarks that reflected continued confidence, reinforcing the belief that the outcome of the case was already effectively decided. However, from where I was seated, I could see that this belief depended entirely on the absence of what I was about to present. As the judge signaled for the next phase of proceedings, attention in the courtroom collectively shifted forward, reinforcing the assumption that what would follow was simply continuation rather than interruption. Yet I understood that in a courtroom, continuation can become reversal in a single moment when missing information is introduced. I remember focusing on the exact point where procedural flow becomes irreversible, because that moment does not announce itself through volume or conflict, but through recognition. The judge leaned forward slightly, preparing to proceed, and in that instant I became fully aware that what was about to happen would not simply add information to the case, but would redefine the structure of everything that had been accepted so far. And as I prepared to stand, I understood with absolute clarity that my father's confidence was still anchored in a version of reality that had never been complete, and that the moment of correction was now no longer approaching, but already beginning.